Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
And good afternoon, everyone. Phil Penarski here with the Wood TV Live Desk. Hope you're all having a great start to your day. Storm Team meteorologist Blake Harms is here, as he is every single Tuesday. And we're also being joined by a very special guest all the way from our sister station, WFLA in Tampa, Florida. It's Rebecca Berry. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the Live Desk today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, you're a meteorologist down in Florida. We're here to really talk about something that a lot of people are going to be very interested in over the next couple of weeks. It's spring break for a lot of people here, not just in the state of Michigan, but really across the Midwest. And plenty of them are flocking down to your neck of the woods to celebrate the time off and the good weather, trying to get out of this frigid cold that we seem to be stuck in here in Michigan. But something that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with is the topic of red tide and what's really going down on Florida beaches right now. As you said, the team at WFLA doing an incredible job with their coverage of the red tide and what's going on. You guys have to deal with it all the time, but here in Michigan, we don't really have to deal with it, rarely ever, maybe the occasional trip down to Florida. For those who maybe aren't familiar that are watching, can you briefly explain, Rebecca, what red tide is?
And so red tide is an algal bloom. It's naturally occurring in the Gulf. And unfortunately, sometimes due to certain circumstances like fertilizer runoff, or we had a power plant that basically had a lot of runoff 2 years ago, sometimes those blooms can feed off of like fertilizers that get put in the water and that sort of thing, and that population really explodes. And so when we're having a red tide bloom, unfortunately, people with respiratory sensitivities may start to cough, their throat may feel itchy, that sort of a thing. It can be very annoying. At its highest level, it can kill fish, and that's some of the most dramatic footage that you see, is that there's a big fish kill that's washed up on the beach. And we did get into that last summer in some areas in the Tampa Bay area, and it's very dramatic and very sad looking. But in general, most of the time, it's just a nuisance and annoyance. It's only really those peak moments where you get the fish kills that it's really a hindrance to people being able to enjoy their vacations down here.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier about how Floridians, this is something that they see all the time. It happens about every single year, and they're used to it, but it's not really an uncommon thing. But is there anything about this specific bloom this year that maybe has troubled some wildlife officials or has really caused a lot of disruption on the beaches?
And so the good news is we haven't seen much in the way of mass fish kills with this one. It did feel like this red tide bloom started a little earlier than normal, and that's largely being credited to the fact that we didn't do much winter in February. We were in the 80s temperature-wise for most afternoons in February, and so our water temperatures are a little warmer than normal for this time of the year. Now, we have started doing some winter over the past 2 weeks. This is probably the wrong crowd to complain to, because we woke up in the 40s and it's miserably chilly. But we are back in the 80s by the end of the week. And so the warmer start seems to be the general thought process, because there is a sweet spot for red tide for that to bloom in terms of water temperature. But also the other thing that we're kind of delving into on our hurricane special, one of my fellow meteorologists, Amanda Holly, is looking at the fact that Hurricane Ian moved through and what effect that might have had on the red tide, whether it's stirring up the naturally occurring red tide from the bottom up to the surface when it came through the Gulf, or any other factors. The watershed rainfall runoff may have had more nutrients in it from Hurricane Ian. So we're kind of looking at how Hurricane Ian's impact may have enhanced this year's red tide bloom.
Yeah, that was kind of going to be my next question, Rebecca, was so there was a big one back in 2018, but it seems like the red tide season is later than what we're experiencing. This seems like kind of the first spring break time frame where we've been talking about red tide being an issue in Florida. Is it occurring earlier than what you would normally expect?
This particular bloom does feel about a month or two early, and we're largely crediting that to such a warm February. The good news is the red tide that we saw 2 weeks ago, which is probably a lot of the footage that you're seeing, has receded a bit from the coastline. We were seeing moderate to heavy levels of red tide 2 weeks ago, and now we're seeing mostly low, only an occasional moderate area of red tide along our coastline. And so it's really a day-by-day situation. It moves with currents, it moves with winds, and so a lot of times in the dead of the summer, we get locked into a westerly wind pattern where we have constant onshore winds, and that blows any red tide that is out there up against the beaches. And so it can feel a little more dramatic and a little bit more of a hindrance during the summer, oftentimes just because of the wind speeds. If there were red tide 10 miles offshore, not a lot of people care about that as beachgoers because they're not experiencing it. It's not impacting them. Of course, fishermen and those sort of things are still worried about red tide, even if it is 10 miles offshore. But once you get that westerly wind pattern set in, and sometimes we get deadlocked in it for weeks, that can be one of the primary times that we see the biggest impact from red tide right along the beaches.
Interesting. Now, you kind of talked about some of the things you look for. How difficult is forecasting a red tide? How much advance can you have before beaches are directly impacted?
We can look at, and so the Florida Fish and Wildlife, it's the FWC, does an excellent job of keeping us informed of the levels every day at 5 p.m. They put out a report with all of the different sample locations all around the different Tampa Bay areas, and they measured it as none detected, low levels detected, moderate levels detected, or high levels detected. And so you can look at that map and look at the wind direction over the next day or so and make a decision. We've got northerly winds because the front's just pushed through. So we're going to, if I'm trying to make it a beach day tomorrow, I'm going to go to our more northern beaches because that red tide's going to be pushed to the south. The only X factor that we really hope doesn't happen is when the red tide gets into some of our small bays, because a lot of times it is very difficult for that to clear out of the bay. And so once it gets into some of the smaller bays, it takes a special combination of winds and currents to get it completely flushed from the bay. But it is a little bit easier because we have that great information from FWC of where the red tide is the worst at the moment, and you can look at the wind speeds and the wind directions over the next couple of days and make an educated decision to see as least red tide as possible.
That's interesting. Yeah, so you kind of mentioned how it seems like it's starting to subside in some areas directly along the beaches, with a lot of families who have vested interest in traveling down for their one tropical week of the year. Does it seem like this may continue to where we may see the impacts from this continue to lessen?
Well, we have had a couple of cold fronts, which we failed to have completely in February, basically. We've had a weekly front lining up on the weekend. It hasn't cooled us down too much. This last one did quite a bit, but it does look like if we continue in this pattern with the fronts, that would help out with things, as well as keep us out of that westerly flow pattern, because we get the winds out of the south and the front pushes through, we get the winds out of the north, and really northeasterly winds are the friendliest winds, and we get that about a day after each cold front. So we are seeing several days in the middle of the week, which would be optimal for spring breakers, where we have those northeasterly winds pushing any red tide that is out there away from the coastline.
Right. Well, I'm sure that's great news for a lot of families, I'm sure, that are watching right now. And you mentioned it earlier, Rebecca. The big thing to focus on with the red tide are these massive fish kills if they happen. That's really sort of the big story, really, in all this. But the red tide does have some impact on humans. Can you just touch on that a little bit about what families could expect if they maybe venture out there and weren't paying attention and kind of got caught up in that?
And so I would liken it to like a very strong allergy. So I was live on Clearwater Beach 2 years ago for the first day of summer special that we did when we were having the high levels of red tide. We were seeing those fish kills. And so I was coughing about every 15 minutes. And as the morning show progressed, it did start to feel like when you swallowed, your throat felt a little bit raw. And it took about an hour to go away. And so if you had respiratory sensitivities, or if you were somehow compromised in that area, it would be a much, much bigger deal. But if you are a normal, healthy person with no complications in that area, it's just annoying. They do an excellent job of clearing the beaches here. If there are any areas of fish kills, the cities and the counties will clear those very quickly, most of the time before dawn. And so you don't end up having to see a lot of that stuff.
Right. And just kind of wrapping up, Rebecca, again, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this very important topic. But just, again, that same issue we're dealing with the spring break and having a lot of beachgoers down there. People are going to want to know if there's anything that they can do to maybe help out or kind of avoid anything to do with red tide. You mentioned the FWC putting out those reports, and how can people sort of keep up to date with that and just make sure that they're on top of everything and don't venture too far south or too far north and might get caught up in this?
And so if I were in your position, I would wake up in the morning, and if it's going to be a beach day today, I would The easiest way to find it is to Google WFLA red tide, and we're going to have a link to that FWC map, but you could also Google FWC red tide, and it's going to have that updated map, and it's just a map of the state, and you see little dots, and the colors are red and yellow and orange, and you could look at that map and make your decision based on where the red tide was the least that day. We have beaches all up and down our coastline, and none of the red tide has made it into the bay yet, and so the safest bet would be to go to downtown St. Pete. We have a little beach down by the pier there. There's going to be no red tide there, but a lot of our beaches are showing very low levels of red tide right now. So especially up near Clearwater Beach, the beaches up in we call it the Nature Coast, which is Citrus, Hernando, and Pasco counties. The beaches aren't as commercialized there, but we're seeing almost no levels of red tide there. So if I were making a decision as a vacationer, I would get up and look at that map and then decide, okay, we're going to check out Clearwater Beach today, or let's head down to Dunedin and watch the sunset there, because they're not showing any levels there. Unfortunately, it's a fact of life that we do have to deal with. I'm hopeful that the science makes some advancements and we can get a better handle on things moving forward, and we can put less nutrients into the water for this red tide to feed off of.
Right, couldn't have said it any better myself, Rebecca. Rebecca Berry with WFLA, our sister station down in Tampa, joining us to talk a little bit about red tide and spring break plans for a lot of Michiganders over the next couple of weeks. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on the live desk. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And of course, if you are going down to Florida, make sure you check out WFLA's coverage. They do a fantastic job of keeping everybody up to date on everything down there as well. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning into this latest edition of the Wood TV Live Desk. For Blake Carnes, I'm Phil Pinarski, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.